For 24 years, history professor Albert Price has been haunted by the ghost of his older brother, who vanished during an anti-war rally at Braxton University in 1969. The official story was that the 5 student leaders fled to Canada to dodge the draft, a narrative Albert never believed. Now, as he writes a book to honor their memory, he gets a call that changes everything. A campus cleanup crew has dredged the university pond and found something that was never supposed to see the light of day. This story is a deep dive into how a single object, hidden for decades, can unravel a web of lies. As we go through it, think about what you would do if you were in Albert's shoes, and stick around until the end to share your thoughts. The year was 1993. Albert Price sat in his university office, surrounded by towers of books and yellowing documents. The air smelled of old paper and stale coffee. On his computer screen was the first chapter of his life's work, a book tentatively titled The Braxton Five: Descent and Disappearance. For most, the 5 students who vanished from Braxton University in the spring of 1969 were a footnote in the turbulent history of the Vietnam War era. For Albert, they were a constant, aching presence. One of them, Martin Price, was his older brother. The official story, the one repeated in newspapers and police reports, was simple and clean. 5 radical student leaders, facing the draft and possible jail time for their activism, chose to flee. They packed their bags in the dead of night and slipped across the border to Canada, never to be heard from again. It was a story that tied up all the loose ends, a convenient explanation that allowed the university and the town to move on. But Albert had never bought it. Martin wasn't the type to run. He was a fighter, principled to a fault. He would have faced prison before he would have abandoned his family and his cause without a single word. This conviction had shaped Albert's entire life. It led him to become a history professor at this very same university, a quiet act of defiance, a way to stay close to the last place his brother was ever seen. He dedicated his career to that specific era, hoping that in some forgotten archive or dusty file, he would find the one loose thread that would unravel the whole official story. Now at 46, the fire of his youth had settled into a low, simmering obsession. The book was his last attempt to set the record straight, to give his brother the legacy he deserved, not the one he was assigned. He was staring at a black and white photo of Martin on his desk, a smiling young man with a protest sign, when the phone on his desk rang. He picked it up, expecting a call from another department. "Professor Price," a voice said, "this is Dale from Facilities Management." Albert didn't know a Dale. "Yes? How can I help you?" "Sorry to bother you, sir. We're doing that ecological cleanup of the campus pond, the one that's been planned for years. We're dredging the bottom to clear out decades of sediment and junk." Albert listened, confused as to why he was being called. "Okay." "Well," Dale continued, "we pulled something up. It's old. Real old. Looks like a piece of a megaphone or something. The campus police took a look and suggested we call you. They said if anyone knew about old university property from back in the day, it'd be the guy writing a book about the 60s. A jolt went through Albert, sharp and electric. The pond. It was right next to the great lawn where the final rally had taken place. "I'll be right there," he said, his voice tight. He hung up the phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. For 24 years, he had searched through paper. Now, something physical had emerged from the depths. He grabbed his coat and hurried out of his office, a strange, unfamiliar feeling rising in his chest, a dangerous glimmer of hope. The scene at the pond was muddy and chaotic. A large dredging crane sat on the bank, a pile of dark, wet sludge next to it. Campus police had cordoned off a small area. Dale, a man in his 50s with a kind, weathered face, pointed to an evidence bag sitting on a portable table. "That's it there, Professor," he said. Albert approached the table. Inside the clear plastic bag was a corroded, cone-shaped piece of metal, caked in mud and green algae. It was unmistakably the bell of an old-style megaphone. It was dented and rusted, but it had survived. A cop standing nearby, Officer Miller, spoke up. "We didn't think much of it at first, but Dale here said it looked like it had been down there a long, long time. We figured it was worth a look before we tossed it." Albert stared at the object. It was more than just old junk. He could feel it. This was something different. This was a relic from that night. "Can I take a closer look?" he asked. Officer Miller nodded. "Be our guest." He put on a pair of latex gloves and carefully opened the bag, lifting the megaphone bell out. It was heavier than it looked. As he turned it over in his hands, wiping away some of the grime, he saw it. On the inner rim of the bell, faint but still legible, were etched numbers. An asset tag. University property. This was logged in the university's inventory, Albert said, his voice barely a whisper. If we can find the logbook from that time, we can find out who this belonged to. Officer Miller looked intrigued. You think this is connected to your brother's case? I don't believe in coincidences, Albert replied, his eyes fixed on the asset tag. Not after all this time. Getting access to the university archives was easy for Albert. It was his second home. Finding a specific procurement log from the late 1960s, however, was another matter. He spent the next 3 days in the chilly, climate-controlled basement of the library, surrounded by shelves of forgotten records. He finally found it in a box labeled Student Affairs, Equipment, and Assets, 1965 to 1970. The logbook was thick and leather-bound, its pages brittle with age. He carefully turned each page, scanning the handwritten entries for the asset number from the megaphone. And then he found it. The number was listed next to an entry dated September 68. The megaphone had been officially assigned to the office of the Dean of Students. A cold knot formed in Albert's stomach. The Dean of Students in 1969 was a man named Cecil Thorne. Thorne had been a towering figure on campus, a staunch conservative, known for his iron-fisted approach to student protests. He was the university's enforcer, the man who publicly condemned the anti-war movement as a threat to American values. According to the official police report, Dean Thorne was at home on the night of the disappearance, miles away from the rally. He had provided a statement the next day, calling the 5 missing students cowards. So, why was his office's megaphone at the bottom of the pond, the very same pond where the students were last seen? This was the thread, the one he had been looking for his whole life. It proved the official story was a lie. Dean Thorne had been there that night, or at least his megaphone had. Albert knew his next step was to talk to Cecil Thorne, but that was easier said than done. Thorne was no longer just a retired dean. He was in his late 70s now, a highly respected philanthropist, and a powerful member of the university's board of trustees. He lived in a luxurious retirement community, shielded from the outside world. Albert's first calls were met with a polite but firm wall. Mr. Thorne does not take unsolicited calls, a secretary informed him. His letters went unanswered. He was being shut out. Frustrated, Albert returned to the original police file, spreading the faded documents across his dining room table. He needed a different angle, another name. He scanned the witness list again. Dozens of students, all of whom had told the same vague story of the rally ending and the 5 leaders walking off toward the pond. Then he saw the other names, the university staff who were on duty, and one stood out, Stanley Finch, campus security. Finch's statement was brief. He claimed he saw the 5 students near the pond's edge, arguing among themselves. He said he thought they were about to get into a fight, but then they just walked off into the darkness together. It was a neat, simple story that supported the idea they left as a group. But now, with the discovery of the megaphone, Finch's statement seemed too simple. If Thorne was there, a security guard would have known. He decided to find Stanley Finch. It took him a week of searching through public records, but he finally found him. Finch had retired a few years after the incident and moved to a small, sleepy town in the foothills of the mountains, a few hours' drive from Braxton. He lived a quiet, reclusive life. He was the perfect person to hold a secret. The drive to Stanley Finch's house was filled with a nervous energy. For the first time, Albert felt he was moving beyond the realm of history and into an active investigation. He was no longer just a professor. He was his brother's advocate. Finch lived in a small, modest bungalow at the end of a gravel road. The yard was overgrown. The paint on the house was peeling. It looked like the home of a man who didn't want to be found. Albert knocked on the door. After a long moment, it creaked open a few inches. An old man with wary, deep-set eyes peered out. He was thin and stooped, a shadow of the uniformed man Albert had seen in old campus photos. "Mr. Finch?" Albert asked. "My name is Albert Price." "Don't know any Price," Finch mumbled, starting to close the door. "Martin Price was my brother," Albert said quickly, holding his ground. "You were the security guard on duty the night he disappeared." The name hung in the air between them. Finch froze. The look in his eyes was not one of confusion, but of a deep, ancient fear. He opened the door a little wider. "You should go," he said, his voice raspy. "That was a long time ago. Nothing to talk about." "They found something in the pond," Albert pressed, pulling a photo of the megaphone bell from his jacket pocket. They found this. He held the photo out. Stanley Finch stared at the image, and all the color drained from his face. His hand trembled as he reached out to take it. He looked from the photo to Albert, his eyes wide with a terror that had been buried for 24 years. He told me they'd never find it, Finch whispered, more to himself than to Albert. He promised me. Who promised you, Stanley? Albert asked, his voice gentle but firm. Who are you protecting? The old security guard looked over his shoulder, as if expecting to see ghosts from his past standing in his living room. He finally sagged against the doorframe, defeated. You better come in, he said, his voice cracking. It's a long story, and it's not one I'm proud of. Albert stepped inside the dark, cluttered house, and the door closed behind him, shutting out the world. He knew he was about to hear the truth, and he was terrified of what it might be. Stanley Finch shuffled to a worn armchair and sank into it, the photo of the megaphone still clutched in his hand. He stared at it for a long time before he began to speak, his voice low and halting. Thorne was a man who believed in order, he began. Above everything else, those protests, they drove him crazy. He saw them as a personal insult, a breakdown of everything he stood for. Albert sat on the edge of a dusty sofa, listening intently, not daring to interrupt. That night, Finch continued, the rally was bigger than anyone expected. Thorne was furious. He was on the phone with the chief of police, demanding they send in troopers to clear the lawn, but the chief refused, worried it would cause a riot. After the main rally broke up, the 5 leaders, including Martin, gathered by the pond to decide their next move. That's when Thorne decided to handle it himself. He told me to stay back, Finch said, his gaze distant. He grabbed that megaphone from his office and stormed down there himself. He said he was going to read them the riot act and expel them on the spot. From his position 100 yards away, Finch watched the confrontation unfold. He could hear Thorne's voice, amplified by the megaphone, booming across the water, filled with rage. The students weren't backing down. They were shouting back, arguing. It all happened so fast, Finch whispered, his voice trembling. Thorne was yelling at your brother, Martin. He got right in his face. Martin didn't flinch. He just stood there. Thorne got so mad, he just shoved him. Hard. Finch paused, taking a shaky breath. Martin stumbled backward. His heel caught on the edge of the stone embankment around the pond. He fell, and his head hit the stone with this awful sound. And then he just rolled into the water and didn't come back up. A wave of nausea washed over Albert. He felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't a disappearance, it was a killing. The other 4 students just froze in shock, Finch went on, tears welling in his eyes. Thorne looked horrified for a second. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. One of the other boys started screaming, and that's when everything fell apart. According to Finch, another man emerged from the shadows of the administration building, a loyal groundskeeper Thorne had on his payroll. In the panic and chaos that followed, Thorne and the groundskeeper moved to silence the witnesses. A struggle broke out. It was 4 terrified students against 2 grown men, one of whom was in a blind panic to cover up what he'd done. It was over in minutes. When the screaming stopped, all 5 students were in the water. Thorne made me help, Finch choked out, shame twisting his face. He said I was an accessory now, that if he went down, I was going with him. We got chains and old engine blocks from the maintenance shed. We tied them down. And we sank them in the deepest part of the pond. Thorne threw the megaphone in after them. He said the pond was university property and that it would never be dredged. It was the perfect hiding place. The story was complete. A violent confrontation, an accidental death, and a panicked, brutal cover-up. The official narrative about them fleeing to Canada was a lie crafted by Thorne the very next day, a lie the university was all too willing to accept to avoid a scandal. Albert sat in stunned silence, the weight of the truth crushing him. He finally knew what happened to his brother, and it was worse than anything he could have imagined. He looked at the broken old man in front of him. You have to tell the police, Albert said, his voice hollow. You have to tell them everything. Stanley Finch looked up, tears streaming down his face, and nodded. I know, he said. I've been waiting for this day for 24 years. I'm tired of living with it. With Finch's confession, everything moved quickly. Albert drove the old security guard directly to the state police barracks, bypassing the local authorities he feared might still be under the university's influence. Finch gave a full, detailed statement. Armed with the confession and the megaphone as physical evidence, detectives obtained a warrant. The next morning, the campus pond was once again a crime scene, but this time it was swarming with forensic divers and investigators. They started in the deep section Finch had pointed out on a map. It didn't take long. The divers sent a signal, and a crane slowly lifted a tangled mass of chains and dark, heavy objects from the murky water. It was them. After 24 years, the Braxton Five had been found. That same afternoon, police cars with sirens silent rolled up the long, manicured driveway of Cecil Thorne's retirement community. They arrested the former dean in his private library. Surrounded by a lifetime of awards and accolades, his picture was in the paper the next day, a frail, indignant old man in handcuffs, his carefully constructed legacy shattered in an instant. The news sent shockwaves through the university and the country. The story of the student protesters who had fled was replaced by the story of the students who were murdered and silenced. For the families of the other 4 students, the discovery brought a similar agony and relief. They had all lived with the same uncertainty, the same nagging feeling that the official story was wrong. Now they had answers, terrible as they were. A week later, a memorial service was held on the great lawn overlooking the pond. Hundreds of people came. Students, faculty, alumni, and the families of the 5 young men. Albert stood with his parents, who were now elderly and frail, and watched as 5 new headstones were unveiled in the university cemetery. Later that evening, Albert walked to the edge of the pond alone. The water was still, reflecting the evening sky. The police tape was gone, replaced by a small, temporary memorial of flowers and photos. He looked at a picture of Martin, laughing with his friends, and felt the grief of the last 24 years finally begin to recede, replaced by a quiet, profound sadness. He had found the truth. He had cleared his brother's name. The mystery that had driven him for his entire adult life was solved. And in the silence that followed, he knew he would finally have to learn how to live without it. The university's leadership chose to protect its reputation over protecting its students, and that lie held for over 2 decades. It makes you wonder, if you were Stanley Finch, the security guard, would you have carried that secret to your grave to protect yourself? Or would the guilt have eventually forced you to come forward? We love bringing these forgotten stories to light, and if you found this one as compelling as we did, consider subscribing and joining our community of history detectives. We'll see you in the next one.